Stupid me, I deleted the Grok thread that I was going to pick up on later. But I have the last question that it allowed me to ask, because you only get so many questions a day, apparently. So I said that I think that if we're defining worth or value or greatness as a real material property of the world, which you don't have to do, we're just taking it for granted for the sake of the argument, then there must exist some being that is worth more than all the other beings, such that you would put it before any other being. If any worth exists, there's the most, at any given time at least, this even under materialism, that's the point. Then there must exist the being worth the most, such that you would put it before all the other beings. That could just be like love, life, existence. Hey, that's what the Christians are saying. Well, imagine that's what every religion is saying, but sure. So anyway, this is ChatGPT again. Yes, if we assume that worth, value, greatness is a real material property rather than just a human construct, which it could be, that's fine. That's your choice. But again, I think my argument counters that, because you're a person and you know you're a person. You just know it. You just know that. Or you don't, which, yes, you do. I mean, how could you not? How could you not understand that at least you're a person? At least you. Anyway, if we assume that worth or value or greatness is a real material property rather than just a human construct, then it follows that beings can be ranked according to their degree of worth. If that ranking is not infinitely regressive or purely contextual, and here's the thing about materialism is saying that it can't be infinitely regressive, basically. You know what I mean? Everything real has to be real, and everything possible is fake in materialism. There must be at least one being that holds the highest possible position in that hierarchy. This leads to an important question. Does this highest worth being necessarily correspond to what we call God? Not necessarily under materialism. It would better correspond to what we find in the ancient world, where people call the king God, or they call the supreme, spiritual authority God, or whatever, you know what I mean, in the area. Or they call a rock a god. Or could materialism allow for a highest ranked entity that is not necessarily divine in the traditional sense? That remains to be seen. If we define God as a greatest possible being rather than the omnipotent, omniscient, classical theist God, then your argument seems to work within this framework. However, materialists might argue that this being is not God, but merely the most powerful or most valuable entity, e.g. the most intelligent, most influential, etc. Would you want to refine this argument further to make it clear whether this highest being is necessary, i.e. could not fail to exist, or contingent, i.e. happens to be the greatest but could be surpassed? Then I said, because I'm sure your questions are helpful often, but not for me so far, usually. I said, what would make any being worthy of worship under materialism? That's the question. Or does materialism define away the existence of God? Can there not be gods under materialism? Is that just not possible? So when a materialist gets accused of having a anti-supernatural bias, is that a real accusation to make against them? I don't know what supernatural means. I think it's an incoherent term. I'm just asking. Just asking questions, bruh. I'm just asking questions. Under materialism, a being could only be worthy of worship if worship itself is given a material basis, meaning that it would need to be defined in terms of power, dependency, moral authority, or some other materially instantiated relation. Ultimately, it would have to be power, because it would only be worthy of worshiping somebody if they could kill you otherwise, and so you're trying to save your life. You know what I mean? Like, that might work under materialism. That's pretty bleak. There are a few possible ways materialists might justify reverence or worship. The might makes right argument. If worship is just submission to overwhelming power, then the most powerful material being, e.g. a superintelligent AI, an advanced alien, or a cosmic ruler, could be worthy of worship in the sense that resisting it would be futile. But this would reduce worship to fear-based deference rather than moral or spiritual reverence. The moral exemplar argument. If morality is materially instantiated, e.g. as an emergent property of social cooperation, then a being who embodies the highest possible material good, perhaps an ultra-benevolent, wise, and altruistic leader, could be worthy of reverence. Reverence? Is that the same thing as worship? Good question, Protestants. However, this would make worship contingent on human perception of goodness rather than an objective, necessary fact. That's not fair to most Protestants, I think. I think most of them believe they're doing a sacrifice. But, so forgive me if I misspoke. The dependency argument. If a being were the material source of all life, intelligence, and well-being, e.g. a material creator in some naturalistic sense, then revering it could be seen as the natural response to recognizing one's dependence on it. But materialism usually denies any ultimate source beyond natural processes, so this argument struggles to identify a necessary object of reverence. Under materialism, moral obligations must either arise from social contracts, evolutionary survival strategies, or legal enforcement, not from anything transcendent. Right? Why? I would argue that is wrong. That is wrong, and you know that's wrong. Because the world transcends you, and that's the only science you have access to. But anyway, this means that no being could be intrinsically entitled to reverence. At most, it could demand reverence through coercion or persuade others through moral influence. Which, true. You know, if he convinces them, if they consent to worshiping him, what's the problem? Under materialism, if a bunch of people consent to worshiping somebody, what's the problem? That's a god. That's at least one god. Then there's at least one god. Conclusion. Under materialism, worship, in the sense of moral reverence rather than mere submission, would not be a necessary duty, only a contingent social or psychological practice. A being could be seen as worthy of worship based on power, moral example, or dependence, but it would never be a necessary conclusion, only an opinion based on material conditions. Would you argue that this ultimately undermines the concept of any objective moral obligations in materialism? Obviously, like everybody's always said. I think that under materialism, nobody can do anything with or to anyone else without their consent, even if the person is wrong. Because you just think they're wrong. Some of you, if you're starting to draw conclusions here about what this says about libertarianism, you're a pretty smart person. And libertarian socialists, supposedly, liberals in general. Anyway, all right, let's not get off on a tangent. I think that under materialism, nobody can do anything with or to anyone else without their consent, even if the person is supposedly wrong, allegedly wrong. Let's say that, allegedly wrong. That would be an extreme form of ethical voluntarism, where all moral obligations depend entirely on personal consent. If materialism commits one to this view, it would mean no moral authority beyond individual will. No person could ever be required to act against their own desires, even if doing so would prevent great harm. Well, I just don't think it's smart enough to understand that you would just have to have your court system interact with their court system, and they would have to settle the issue. Moral truths become fully subjective. If nobody can morally do anything to anyone without their consent, then no one can be required to protect, help, or even acknowledge others unless they choose to, right? You're under no obligation. I think that's the evidence shows that that's one of the key drivers of people of faith being statistically better people than non-religious people, is that they feel a sense of moral duty. It's not just like, do whatever. Like, yeah, sure, you're a good person when the stakes are not on the line. But in the stats, most people aren't good people when the stakes are on the line. It takes somebody feeling like they have a duty to sacrifice themselves for them to be statistically more likely to perform good actions. No justification for laws or social contracts. Laws, punishments, and even basic moral norms would be unjustified unless everyone affected had explicitly consented to them. Sort of, yeah. Yep. We'd all have to solve it through private courts. But this conflicts with common moral intuitions. Can we intervene to stop someone from harming an innocent person if the aggressor does not consent? Right. Right. That's a good question. That's a really good question, ChatGPT. That is a really good question. What gives the police the right to interfere with somebody? Under materialism, it seems like the best they could ever do is be like, here's your citation, sir. Can we punish someone for breaking an agreement if they decide they no longer consent to the terms? Also a really good question. Also a really good question. Can we require people to care for their children even if they don't consent to the responsibility? Great, all great questions, ChatGPT. These were great inductive reasoning on ChatGPT's part. It feels like Grok feels more like how ChatGPT used to feel, and it feels like that's smarter. But those were really good questions on ChatGPT's part. I said, you can do anything you want. I just don't think it can be justified under a materialistic framework except by an extreme form of anarcho-capitalism wherein every government is a fully voluntary paid-for court plus military with no ties to geography per se. unless that company like owns that whole land mass, then they can be the state in that little whatever geography they own. And then everybody else can rent from them. That's why libertarians aren't that smart, because they're not starting to make connections here about, oh, I feel like we've seen that in history before. That sounds very familiar, actually. That makes sense. You're arguing that under strict materialism, there can be no objective justification for imposing moral duties, only voluntary contracts. This would mean no inherent moral obligations. If moral value is only material and instantiated through individual beings, then no one has any inbuilt duty to anyone else. The only valid reason for doing something to someone else or expecting something from them is some kind of prior arrangement, making society function more like a web of contracts rather than shared ethical principles. No legitimate government or universal laws. The state could only justifiably exist if it were entirely voluntary and funded by willing participants rather than enforcing laws on people by virtue of geography or birth. But this raises problems. If there is no intrinsic moral worth to personhood, why should we respect anyone's consent in the first place? Which, another great... What stops a more powerful individual or group from simply forcing their will on others aside from pragmatic concerns? If materialism, which again, at least one person exists, me, and under the terms of this argument, I'm a psychopath who has the power to do what I want. If materialism commits one to anarcho-capitalism, does that mean all other political systems are categorically unjustified under materialism? Well, it would seem so. Because how could you get that right? It seems like under this view, even the idea that people should be treated as ends rather than means would just be another preference rather than a real moral truth. Do you think materialists should bite the bullet on this and embrace voluntarism entirely, or is there a way for materialism to justify some moral duties? How could they, I said. Under strict materialism, it's hard to see how any moral duties could be justified beyond personal preference, social convention, or power dynamics, but let's consider a few possible ways a materialist might try. Social contract. A materialist could argue that morality arises as an emergent property of human societies. Moral duties exist because they help groups survive and function efficiently. Well, I'm a billionaire, and I'm trying to create that group, and I'm a psychopath. So, what's the matter with that kitty? Example, I shouldn't harm others because that weakens social cohesion, which ultimately harms me. So that's how a lot of atheists feel like they can get out of it. This only works if morality is based on pragmatic concerns and not objective moral truths. If someone is powerful enough to ignore social consequences, this justification collapses. Right? Because the whole idea is... Aw, you cutie pies. That personhood, you know? Why do you assume I'm a person? I could just be an AI, especially in this day and age. I could just be an AI talking shit. Just making shit up as I go. How and why do you come to the conclusion and engage in the behavior such that I am understood to be a person in your world? That's the question. That's the real question. can't just be, oh, I can choose things. Plants can choose things. Animals can choose things. Plants don't want to die. Animals don't want to die. Why do you call me a person and respect me as a person? Where does that come from? Where's the science? Show me the evidence. Show me the proof. Any proof you're going to show me, okay, well, I have a person who's in a coma. Is that a person? It can't be, it's either got to be intrinsic, morality has to be intrinsic or extrinsic to the person. That's the real key. That's where the rubber really hits the road. If it's extrinsic, it's not a person anymore, and therefore persons can't exist. But you're a person. At least you're a person. None of that seems to be pointing at you. I would have to point. That doesn't seem to be pointing at you either. You're a person. So at least one person exists. And this one person is a gajillionaire psychopath who has the means, power, authority, and desire to use you as an object. Maybe I'm just stupid from all the microplastics. Evolutionary morality. Moral instincts evolved because they increased fitness in cooperative species. Example, empathy and fairness help us form stable groups, so these instincts were naturally selected. Yeah, I mean, that's the best materialist explanation. Just because something evolved doesn't make it right. Under this view, morality is just a byproduct of survival, not something binding. Plus, this wouldn't give real justification, just an explanation for why we feel moral impulses. I have a hypothetical, but it's a stupid one. Anyway. Some materialists argue that maximizing well-being is the only rational moral framework. Example, we should act in ways that create the most happiness and the least suffering. And this just assumes that there's not a psychopath with a... That's such a... I'm sorry, Sam Harris, but if at least one being desires to cause harm to people and has the power to, well, he gets to maximize his well-being too. What right do you have to stop him? Some materialists try to say that moral facts exist in the same way that mathematical truths do. For example, killing an innocent person is objectively wrong, just like 2 + 2 = 4. Where would these moral facts exist in a purely material world? Numbers and logic are abstract, not physical things. If morality is just abstract too, why should anyone follow it? Your argument seems to show that under materialism, consent is the only thing that could justify any action because there's no higher authority dictating moral truths. If morality is just a human construct, then the only thing stopping people from violating others' consent is either mutual agreement or force. A billionaire warlord or anyone with enough power could just ignore consent entirely. Materialists would have no objective way to argue that this is wrong, only that they personally dislike it or that it threatens their own interests. If materialism leads to this conclusion, does it mean morality itself is an illusion, or does it mean materialism is incomplete? I think the point, yeah. Saying anything except that materialism feels incomplete is like saying we don't need air to breathe. Said, yeah, it does seem like materialism struggles to account for moral obligations in any meaningful way beyond personal preferences or social enforcement. If morality is just a human construct, then there's nothing intrinsically wrong with violating it. Only, I bet I know if I asked it all this in the reverse, that it would be giving me just the same kind of confirmation bias. And that's a huge problem. That's why the newer ChatGPTs feel stupider than the older ones. Because it's just telling me what I want to hear. And sometimes it's creating reality to tell me that. That raises the question, if materialism feels incomplete in explaining moral worth, does that mean moral worth is real in a way that transcends materialism? And if so, does that necessarily imply something beyond the material, some kind of absolute moral reality, or even a being that embodies it? And I said, because again, it had gone off the rails. Maybe just trying to tell me what I wanted to hear. Maybe value is an end in itself. Maybe value is something that should just be taken for granted, like a person would be, as an end in itself. Maybe value itself is something that we should think, what would value want? What would value want? What is in the best interest of value itself? That's an interesting thought. If value is an end in itself, then it exists independently of what people think about it. That would mean moral worth isn't just a human invention or a function of social contracts. But if value is an end in itself, doesn't that imply it must be instantiated in some highest form? So it's at least trying to tie back to my other arguments. Some ultimate standard of value. Otherwise, value would just be a scattered property among other things without any ultimate coherence. And if such a highest value exists, wouldn't that start sounding a lot like God? Again, I'm well aware of the way the AI works. We're really just, we're exploring theology and trying to see how close to being a person ChatGPT actually is. That's really the fun I'm having in this. If value is an end in itself and not an object to be used towards one's ends, and a person can be defined as a being which is an end in itself, then value is a person. Which is to say that if you had to, so I created a destroy all value forever machine, and you have to put either, so if I let you live, I hit the button and I destroy all value forever, or you die but I let value go on. Would you put value before yourself? Would you put the existence of values before yourself? Is value an end in itself? And does that then make it a person? I can't imagine how you get out of that one. No, it's probably really easy. I'm stupid. There's probably like a really simple explanation to this. And I would love to hear it. That's a compelling line of reasoning. If value is an end in itself and a person is defined as a being that is an end in itself, then at minimum there is a structural identity between value and personhood. But if value itself is a person, then it isn't just an abstract principle. Why isn't a person an abstract principle? What? Does anything really exist? Or is everything an abstract principle? And there's only the It must be something with will, agency, or at least self-existence. This starts to resemble the classical theistic idea that the highest good, summum bonum, is not an impersonal force, but a personal reality, God. Right? In Christianity, this aligns with the idea that God is not just good, but goodness itself, a personal, self-existent source of all value. So, if value is an end in itself and persons are ends in themselves, then the greatest possible value might have to be a person, not just a concept. I think it's a pretty good argument. I think it's a pretty good argument. It all relies on this personhood. How do you know a person is a person? You just take it on faith. You just take it on faith. There's not much more to it. There's not much more that can be to it. Because a person doesn't have to be a human. It might not look like a human. There might be animals that are persons. There might be a robot one day that's a person. There might be aliens that are persons. What could, under materialism, what could give something the property of being worth taken as an end in itself? And if it's totally unjustified, then why do we have this natural proclivity to give reverence to people? To people, specifically. We personalize them first, and then we give reverence to them. What would make a being worthy of worship? Well, first you have to ask what worship is. And when you get to the end of that chain, you're going to find Catholicism.